Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 15 of season 2 of Babylon 5, and now for a word. ISN presents 36 Hours on Babylon 5 with Cynthia Talkman. Since humanity has headed out from the solar system, 24 worlds in 14 solar systems have been colonised, apparently. And also, apparently, Babylon 5 isn't as well supported as it used to be. Also, expect the unexpected. The ISN crew found themselves caught up in the Narn-Centauri conflict even before they set foot on the station, it seems. Nice bit of interplanetary expedition sponsorship of the special. So Cynthia immediately starts sticking her nose in as Franklin tries to treat the wounded, with Sheridan generally not knowing the state of play at this point. Londo, of course, is spinning it for all he's worth. Apparently they only made first contact 100 years ago, painting it as an unprovoked attack by the Narn that endangered humans on the station. Jakar, of course, has a different perspective. Such fun as extras try to get it into the news footage. Eduardo, from any means necessary, reappearing, and Corin being interviewed with Ivanova lurking in the background. Sheridan is fairly laid back about his posting, seeing it as part of military life to end up in places you don't expect. Franklin is more philosophical, appreciating that most people back home just won't understand what it is to exist on a space station, day in, day out. He doesn't exactly give a cheery tale either, recounting when a friend accidentally spaced himself. Jakar makes an official pronouncement that the Centauri transport was carrying weapons to the front line, and if necessary, the Narn will shut Babylon 5 down to stop it being used as a weapons supply point by the Centauri. Cut back to an interview with Senator Quantrell, in charge of Babylon 5. In light of President Clark's growing popularity for focusing on Earth, is Babylon 5's budget justified? Sheridan is less than impressed by the comments, especially the misguided belief that Earth could have somehow won out against the Minbari or Vorlons even now, having recovered its military strength somewhat. Hilariously, Ivanova is being described as perky and energetic in getting her name mispronounced. She enlisted because her brother was killed in the war, and felt she should try and finish what he started, but by the time she was qualified, the war was over. Garibaldi just hopes to come out of his interview without losing his job over it. Garibaldi would just like one day when nothing happens, but ultimately he'd like to make a difference. We learn aliens are 42% of Babylon 5's population at any given time. Cynthia is chuffed because she managed to snag a glimpse of Kosh while setting up for her current segment. Interestingly, she gives his full name Kosh Naranek. I'm not entirely sure if you've heard him called anything other than just Kosh to this point. Cynthia is also on the hunt for another ambassador she deems elusive, Delenn, who she's finally been granted an interview with. Delenn gives quite a lot of cultural information, Minbari buildings being carved out of crystal, 3 languages, one of which is the religious castes. However, Cynthia soon springs claws when she turns to Delenn's transformation and how the 250,000 humans killed in the war might feel about her now emulating humanity. Delenn is clearly not prepared for this line of questioning. As she becomes upset, she is called to the council chambers as proof has emerged thanks to Ivanova's investigatory work that the Centauri vessel was indeed carrying arms. Jakar wants other Centauri vessels around the station impounded, whilst Londo says they have the sovereign right to carry whatever cargo they choose and transfer it outside the station. Sheridan is in the middle of the two, saying that in Babylon 5 space the sovereign rights are basically his. As Delenn also seeks solutions, the lights dim and Ivanova calls Sheridan to CNC, saying they have a shooting war on their hands as Narn and Centauri ships start engaging each other outside the station. Initially, the Star Furies monitor the situation, and Ivanova advises that both ambassadors have said that attacking their ships would be considered an act of war. Sheridan decides that his priority is safeguarding the station's population and orders the Furies to engage. Being dedicated space superiority fighters, they rapidly get the situation under control again, and Sheridan tersely orders the ambassadors to another meeting, with the ISN's hovering drone camera watching on. Cynthia now interviews Jakar, who outlines the Centauri occupation of his homeworld 150 years ago. He was very young, as the long rebellion against the Centauri was drawing to a close, and things were tense. His father, working in a Centauri household because their mother was too ill to be smuggled out, accidentally spilled a cup of hot jala on the mistress of the house and was sentenced to death by being strung up on a tree. Jakar went to him on the 3rd day, and his father told him he was proud he would be able to fight where he had not been able to, and died. So for Jakar, everything to do with this conflict is intensely personal. He vehemently denies the suggestion that Narn are losing the war, saying that they will never surrender, and that for them, as with some Earth people, the words never again have special meaning. Londo, of course, tells of the wondrous benefactors the Centauri were to the Narn, raising up the more primitive species and taking them to the stars with them. He denies they were driven off Narn, saying it simply became too expensive, and had they been asked to leave, they would have done so happily. Their repayment is terror and territorial encroachment. That must now end, and he notes conveniently that the Narn declared war, not the Centauri. As Cynthia notes back in C&C, while the Centauri talk about desiring peace, the reality in local space is anything but peaceful. As if to underline the point, a large Centauri battlecruiser jumps in virtually on top of the station to blockade it until the Centauri transports are released, unopened. Londo is not slow in threatening the station itself, should it interfere. ISN then cuts to a delightful ad reminiscent of something out of Starship Troopers, encouraging parents to get their kids tested for psi abilities, pretty much anywhere they'd like to, because those Psychops are such warm, cuddly fellows. During the ad, a semi-subliminal message flashes up as well. The Psy-Corps is your friend. Trust the Corps. 30 hours into the ISN show, the Centauri blockade continues, and traffic in and out of the station has been halted. Sheridan tells Cynthia the sides are still talking, while Jakar says this simply demonstrates how far the Centauri will go, and says it cannot be permitted. The Babylon 5 senator talks about how terrible what happened next was, with Cynthia pointing out people die in war all the time, but he says it wouldn't have been in their backyard if Babylon 5 wasn't out there. Cynthia is back in C&C as Sheridan gives the cruiser an ultimatum. Earth will not tolerate terrorism and will not release the Centauri ships, and so the station's defense grid will fire on the cruiser if it attacks B5 traffic. On the off chance they're not bluffing, the transport Sheridan sends out is unmanned, but he really doesn't think the Centauri want a war on two fronts. And he's right. The transport gets out unmolested to applause from the C&C crew. Unfortunately, immediately after, a Narn cruiser jumps in to assist and ignores Sheridan's instructions to stand down. The capital ships go toe-to-toe, and the Narn just edge the victory, with the station catching a chunk of debris into the bargain. However, no one actually wins. The Narn cruiser is so badly damaged that its jump engines can't hold an exit jump point together, and the strain causes the ship to explode. The ISN conclusion is quite balanced, acknowledging that this is far from a normal day for the station, and asks the question of various actors, is Babylon 5 worth it? Garibaldi says yes, because we learn as we go. Londo says yes, because he sees opportunity. Shakar is far less certain. Ivanova is monosyllabic in the affirmative. Delenn applauds humanity's ability to forge communities out of seemingly disparate groups, while the Earth Senator is almost dismissive. Franklin sees the opportunity to save lives, whilst Eduardo wants a good pension. Sheridan says Babylon 5 is all about building the future, creating the peace, not enforcing it. So absolutely yes. Good night, Cynthia. This episode works really well on a number of levels, and if you wanted to introduce someone to the show, this would probably be quite a sensible episode to use, because it's almost a documentary on the state of the universe and what's gone on before. You get backstory left, right and centre, plus some very interesting adverts and space battles. You really can't fault the sheer speed at which this episode moves. The only negative I really noticed, and this may be a DVD issue, is that some of the shots seemed very cropped vertically. I'm not sure why. More than willing to blame the player on my machine, quite frankly. It's even quite a tricky episode to comment on, because the whole episode is in and of itself a commentary on the events of the episode due to its very clever format. Even when Cynthia isn't on screen, the characters are still being filmed, or the footage is from a maintenance bot tie-in, so I don't think it ever breaks its character in that sense. Obviously we know that there's a war going on, but whilst Londo's interview on the subject doesn't really break new ground, Jakar's does, and is a poignant example of just why the Narn have cause to want the Centauri removed from the universe. By the same token, it's a reminder that they're not really a hugely advanced race in some respects. Loud and brash, yes, but much of their tech is inherited, and we don't really know how well resourced they are. Cynthia doesn't really have anything to gain when she says they've lost the vast majority of their recent engagements, so it's apparent that while they were effective at annoying the Centauri, going toe-to-toe with them may not have been something they were really prepared for. Delenn clearly miscalculated in allowing herself to be interviewed. I wonder if she would have reacted in quite the same way were she still fully Minbari. The point being made very clearly here, of course, is that she isn't anymore, and so her reaction actually reinforces that. I don't think Cynthia is being particularly unfair. This is what a good investigative reporter would do, I suppose, but it's painful to watch Delen's reaction to the accusation that she's basically dishonouring the human dead by taking on human characteristics, because the Minbari consider themselves honourable. So this is something Delen's going to have to reconcile in her own head now. Nice to see some of the lower decks characters being interviewed too, even if only for comic relief from our point of view. It's a very nice touch, and of course Ivanova's reactions are as on point as we'd expect. Such fun. You may recall this isn't the first encounter the station has had with an ISN reporter being on board, and there are some distinct echoes here, with Sheridan's take on it being a little different to Sinclair's, although they both get the last say. As you may know by now, I'm a great fan of the way Babylon 5 handles its ship combat, and this is no exception, as we see both fighter and capital ship combat in this episode, complete with heads-up display graphics and mainbot perspectives that just showcase what was achievable with CGI, giving you complete freedom over where you put the camera and where you can put your models. It was also a nice touch to have some debris head for CNC with the blast doors shutting. It just reinforces how incredibly vulnerable Babylon 5 is to space combat when it has no shields. Interesting little comment from Ivanova about the new defence grid that was installed during the Gropos episode, being enough to hold off the Centauri cruiser if push came to shove. It would have to be a considerable upgrade, because the old one didn't seem overly effective against capital ships, see Voice in the Wilderness for example. Just to consider the other subtexts here, the senator who ostensibly should be big-upping Babylon 5 really isn't. Instead he's sucking up to Cynthia and by extension perhaps President Clark. It would seem Senator Hidoshi, who always had Sinclair's back, isn't around now. Interplanetary expeditions sound like the sort of outfit who would be involved in trips to find new old tech, as seen in Infection in Season 1. And we have the Psi Corps being all cuddly and send your children to us, it'll all be excellent. Nothing suspect going on there at all. The subliminal message would have been properly subliminal in the show's universe, of course, but I recall at the time JMS said it had to be a minimum duration for the networks here in order to avoid them being accused of being, well, Psi Corps, I suppose. Interesting too that the Psi Corps representative is a Psi cop, not just some generic telepath, seemingly trying to make even the most powerful telepaths acceptable to the general populace. There are times during the episode where you feel like Cynthia might be a little too pro-Clark, a little too anti-Babylon 5, by showing the dropping approval ratings and attacking Delen. Yet at the end, her conclusion is actually very objective, and at pains to point out that this is not a typical day for the station. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts on her and the way the whole episode was framed. I think it worked really well, and as I've mentioned, it would be a good in for someone who's never seen the show before, because yes, it inevitably spoils certain things, but it isn't terrible in that sense, whilst at the same time giving us a pretty good broad brush of how we've arrived where we are and what the state of the universe is. I'm not sure if that was a particular driver for this episode. I actually think it was designed to give us an in-universe view of Babylon 5's place in Earth's current political machinations as much as anything else. The summaries are just a bonus. So yes, cleverly done, nicely paced, and I think the other takeaway from this is just how damn arrogant the Centauri now feel they can be. They blockaded the entire station, threatening deadly force, and called it a peaceful protest. That's a hell of a departure from ceding territory to the Narn just a year ago. What's interesting is that their arrogance is somewhat misplaced, because their big chunky capital ship does get taken out by virtue of making itself a big stationary target at a known location. So even though the Narn ship goes down, in chess terms, I'd call that more than a fair exchange and a morale booster for the Narn. With that thought, I shall leave you as we approach the final third of the season.